Good morning, Professor Spooner. How are you today?
Good morning, Frank. I'm fine, thanks, and I hope you are too.
Thank you.
It's cold outside, but it's warm in here. And one of the interesting things on the news this week that I think has something to do with globalization is arguments about the alphabet soup of LGBTQ, and that it should. Some people have been suggesting it should be simplified just as Q. And others have complained that was a pejorative term when it was first introduced in the middle of the last century, and so we shouldn't go back to it now, even though it's probably no longer pejorative. But I thought this was interesting because it's an indication of the way things keep happening that are the result of a difference in the quality of human society, all deriving from the fact that we're a social species, even though doctors study us as individuals, and social science is still considered to be a second-rate science. In order to understand human life properly, we have to understand how we operate together. Mm-hmm. And since we, in the last 10,000 years or so, since we progressed from the Paleolithic condition of wandering around in small groups to gather food, to the current post-industrial digital age, the numbers of people interacting with each other, dependent on each other, forming part of a social whole, has increased at an incredible rate, so that we, from a global population of 1 million, where everybody was basically the same, except in terms of age, we've got to the point now where there are so many different ways to be a part of society, and it's only really since the middle of the last century, in our lifetimes, that we've been trying to put into practice our ideas of the necessity of equality that we started talking about, three or maybe 4 centuries ago at most. So starting in the 1950s, the qualitative distinction between being male and being female has gradually diminished, although I don't know that one could say that it's completely disappeared. The sanctity of a marriage partnership has certainly changed. So I have relatives now who don't see the point, who have very pleasant families and no likelihood of them parting or in any way violating their contractual relationship. And then and then we've more or less, the problem of racism has diminished. We've introduced the term culture, which seems to be working reasonably well, that takes account of what the differences are in social relationships in different parts of the world and in different parts of a large society. But the more recent thing that has become accepted, but not completely, what should I say, integrated into the larger society so far, is sexuality. And so we started off with queer, and then I think by the 1970s we were using the term gay, and lesbian. Of course, the Greeks had made lesbian, right. What should I say, generally known, if not necessarily generally acceptable. And then in the last few decades, it's become not only possible to be, besides L, G, but to be B or bisexual or
Transgender.
T, transgender. And I'm not sure why Q was put on the end again.
That's a relatively
But
new addition, isn't it? And it had been LBGT for a while, then all of a sudden in the past year, Q appeared.
yeah, but it's now one actually can, in the same way that one can make up one's own mind whether one's a heterosexual or or a homosexual, one can now make up one's own mind whether one's which gender one belongs to, and you have to be very careful about accepting people of the not necessarily insisting on talking to them as though they're in the gender that you think they're biologically born into, but accepting them according to the gender that they consider themselves socially to belong to. So this is a very interesting story of the change in social life.
It's an unbelievable story, and when you think about it, it really couldn't strike at a more fundamental aspect of change insofar as what's allowed for the human species to be born in as one gender, and to determine that you wish to be considered and interpreted as another gender, and then to have the society enforce legal laws to allow you to have that right. That's going a pretty long way. Who would have thought that 10,000 years ago?
One wonders whether this is the end of the story, or whether something else is still waiting for us. That has to do with certain biological differences that we haven't even thought about yet. But I mean, certainly age also has ceased to be the differential that it used to be, because retirement is becoming, I mean,
doesn't
there's
exist
no retirement
anymore.
age in America anymore,
Right.
and this is changing in other parts of the world as well, and people are living longer.
I sent you, there was an article, an opinion section in the New York Times this morning by Nicholas Kristof, who is a pretty deep thinker. And the article was, or the opinion was, let's wage a war on loneliness. All right, and I sent it to you. And the first sentences, there are two that are actually of interesting, is, the dateline is London. We humans make a lonely crowd, and it's killing us. Social isolation is more lethal than smoking 15 cigarettes a day or than obesity, according to recent research. Since obesity in the U.S. is associated with up to 600,000 deaths a year, the implication is that loneliness is a huge, if silent, killer. In Britain, the country has taken the lead on how to address the loneliness epidemic. Last year, it appointed a minister for loneliness. It touches almost every one of us at some point. Baroness Barron, the current minister for loneliness, told me it can lead to very serious health consequences, et cetera, forcing people to become isolated and disconnected from society.
That's very interesting. Yes. And it's interesting that, and I think we have maybe mentioned this before, that one of the things that kept religion going for so long was that we needed to belong.
Mm-hmm.
And now, nevertheless, atheism has grown, but satisfying the need to belong has become a problem. And I have a group of research students who work with me trying to find how people in West Philadelphia manage to belong if they don't go to church anymore. And we haven't found the answer yet.
Right, right. Well,
Uh,
the reason I thought of it was because of something prompted me when we were talking about the LBGTQ and how people are now possessed with the right to change their gender identification in a desire to belong. And if it just there's a big problem in society today. Despite I mean it's a real anomaly. I mean, given the communication systems we all have and the increasing globalization that we're all facing, that more and more people are feeling isolated and alone. It shouldn't be this way.
So there are these two forces then that are in somehow in what should I say, in conflict. One is the subcultural, the cultural division that keeps increasing within the larger cultural community, and at the other, but also the how should I characterize the other one? The problem of how to decide which subcultural community you belong to, and how to manage belonging in one way or another.
And it used to be 100 years ago, you didn't have a choice as to what subcultural community you belonged to. You were assigned to that by birth or by circumstance or environment or by parents. And now there's this virtual buffet, this smorgasbord of choices that the individual faces, you're catching me at a difficult moment on a Sunday morning for me to try to overcome this. But I mean, I really think that it's simply the sheer variety of choice that's presented to the individual that causes difficulty in selecting. I mean, and let's face it, no one selects one choice and sticks with it for life. It's a complete combination of choices that are made, remade, revised, redone. And
and everything has a relationship with the traditional categories.
It does,
which are still, to some extent, valid.
There are some, even though we're talking about people changing their sexual identification, there are still some things correct that if they can't be changed on the outside. Well, they may be able to be changed on the outside, so to speak, but on the inside, people still carry the baggage with them.
Yeah, yeah. So it's going to be interesting to see how things develop in the rest of this century, since the change seems to be continuing at an accelerating rate.
I can't even imagine.
And whether language will have something to do with it, because certainly the number of people, the proportion of the world's population that is able to intercommunicate linguistically is growing. Mostly with English, but to some extent with other languages.
Well, all right. You want to hold it there? We'll see where we end up next week.
Yes, I think so.
All right. Well, thank you, Professor Spooner. Have a good week, and we'll look forward to starting up again next weekend. Thank you. Spooner, how are you today?
Good morning, Frank. I'm fine, thanks, and I hope you are too.
Thank you.
This morning, I think you know that some time ago now, in an introductory essay to a volume on globalization, I wrote that globalization was on the cards from the start, because I thought that the fact that population growth had led us to spread throughout the world, and we had language meant that sooner or later we were all going to be in contact with each other. But what's always puzzled me is why, in fact, do people always collect together in the largest possible numbers? And that's happened throughout human history. And until about 10,000 years ago, the numbers were always very small because of the availability of food, and we were not yet producing our own food.
Mm-hmm.
But since food has not become a problem, we keep collecting together in larger and larger numbers, and now we're going to become a totally urbanized world in what remains of this century, as far as I can see. Anyway, somebody I met in an elevator a few years ago and got talking to about the axial age and big history, and then we became quite close friends and have been talking to each other ever since. Had an interesting new idea this week, which he told me about, which I think helps us to understand a lot of things. And that is that when we left our primate cousins up in the trees in South Central Africa and came down onto the plains and wandered out away from the trees on the plains, we were vulnerable to predators. Yes. In a way that we had never been before. And it was then that we started collecting together in larger and larger numbers in order for security. And that tendency seems to have been part of our evolution, because after all, we had not evolved entirely into the creatures we became in the following millennia. That was hundreds of thousands of years ago. Mm-hmm. And so I think that explains it. However, the problem, of course, that we have now is that we have to organize ourselves, and it's our organization of ourselves which is leading to all the problems. So this evolutionary proclivity that appears to have been launched a few 100,000 years ago is still driving us to collect together in larger and larger numbers. And now there are really no restrictions on that process. Mm-hmm. But because as the numbers get larger, the organizational problems get bigger. All the problems we're having in globalization have to do with different forms of organization. And of course, when the literacy helped us to develop much larger forms of political organization and economic organization, for that matter. And then the age of empires started with literate administrations some 4,000 years ago, and lasted really until the middle of the last century, when we finally got rid of the European empires. But the empires really did bring things closer together. Mm-hmm. But the problem with the empires was that they divided the world up into administrative districts, and when they disintegrated and ceased to be empires in the middle of the last century, or in the first since 1900, their administrative districts became what we have come to call nation states, because of the problems of the relation of the interrelation of spiritual and political authority, mm-hmm. which we've sold in some ways for some periods, as with the Pope and the archbishops and so on in the Catholic Church, but not on a permanent basis, as we can see with the Reformation 500 years ago. Anyway, so now we have this problem of conflict between, since the end of the Age of Empires, we've had a sort of fake empire run by America as the world hegemon, um, and that has added to the problems of the um, formation of nation states, because the whole point of the formation of nation states was that each state would be independent in terms of religion as well as political organization, and it would and no state would have the right to tell neighboring states what the correct interpretation of the Bible was.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem with American hegemony has been that not only has it been influencing the development of nation states since the end of the empires, but it's also been exerting cultural influence in other ways. And so now we have this terrible problem between, well, with Iran, for example, in the Middle East. And last Friday, when we were unable to meet, I spent the day in Washington at a board meeting of an organization that is a consortium of American universities, and I was representing the University of Pennsylvania, working out how to solve some of the current problems of the American Institute of Iranian Studies, which is an organization that began in the late 60s that I've been involved in ever since. And of course, since the Iranian Revolution has not been able to function in the way that it was functioning before. And this has meant that whereas we had a way of training Iranists, people specializing in Iranian studies, which is quite a well-developed historical field of academic study, but since then, since the late 70s, we've not been able to train anybody in this field. Mm-hmm. And now all the people who were trained in that field and were heading programs in half a dozen universities in America, apart from other universities in Europe,
they're all retiring.
Are retiring, and there's nobody to replace them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this means that whereas up until 50 years ago, we knew a lot about the world, that is in universities, although people in the State Department tended not to know very much about the rest of the world. Now, in the age of globalization, because of what we've been doing in other ways, we're not training scholars and scientists with experience in the world as a whole.
Right. Let me jump in a little bit. You've thrown a lot at me from that one elevator ride, and thankfully you indicated that you had developed a close friendship with this person, and it was not all in one elevator ride. I fully understand the fact that Neanderthals who descended from the trees and were able to make it out to the plains, especially those who could hold their young under one arm to get out to the watering hole, and thus were forced to stand up straighter because they were carrying their young, and then do that and get back into the safety of the woods, and then come back the next day with another mother with another young child, and then groups of them eventually, in order to just protect themselves in the event of predators, so more would be able to return to the safety of the trees. And going on to where we are today, I mean, this is a blink of an eye in history, right? This is what, 30 or 40 or 50,000 years or so. So where this is going to go, I think where that group of Neanderthal mothers with their babies at a watering hole out in the middle of a plain in South Central Africa, 5 or 6 of them, 50,000 years ago, to where we are now with 22 million people living in Mexico City, or 1.5 billion people connected on Facebook. to have happened in 50,000 years is pretty remarkable. Um, and then I superimposed that fact on the President of the United States making the speech on Wednesday in front of the United Nations, in which he said globalization is dead. It's no longer operable. It's been replaced by national patriotism. And I just don't get it. I don't understand it. Is it a complete? I mean, the speech had to have been written. It clearly was not written by the president. The way he delivered it was clear. He had not read it before. It's official policy of the United States government. I mean, how is it that people are not understanding what's happening, where even the most ill-informed president of this country can stand there and make that kind of remark? I don't understand where the disconnect is. What do you think?
There's so much competition between political units of different sizes. So the large ones compete with each other globally, and now there's competition, obviously, between developing competition between America, Europe, European Union, and China, and India, actually, and locally, but among smaller units. So between Afghanistan and Pakistan, which their relationship's been in the news this past week because they can't agree on their border, which again was drawn by the British in 1893. And Africa is just a patchwork of these problems. So I'm afraid, in my mind, of course, I have to be careful what I say so that I don't appear to be chauvinist, but I think that America is causing more problems like this than any of the other large countries at the moment, although that may change as the others gradually become more powerful. Because, to a large extent, the reason is that the people in charge of policy in this country are not academically trained to understand what's going on in other parts of the world. And 50 years ago, I don't think people in America were that well trained either, partly because they are, whereas in Europe, every country is very close to every other country, and then many of them had empires which took them in to all over the world. America didn't have an empire, at least not in that sense, and had two large ponds, one on either side, which separated it from what was going on in other parts of the world. And now we're told that only 30% of Americans, even now in the 21st century, have passports.
Right. So
it really is an anomaly that the economically most powerful country in the world is the center of the least knowledge about what's going on in the rest of the world.
So in a funny way, when we several years ago would talk about nations or states, we would talk about states that were actively trying to thwart the forces of globalization. All right, and we would talk about countries such as North Korea. We would talk a little bit about Iran, I think, even. Where we are now, after several years of discussion, the United States has now entered that category.
Yeah.
Isn't that something?
Well, I mean, it's such a paradox, really, that the Middle East is most of the boundaries in the Middle East were drawn by Europeans and then reinforced by Americans. and American policy since the middle of the last century has been to not to export democracy, but to reinforce political stability as Americans understood it, which was not democracy, because democracy was unpredictable, partly because it wanted to nationalize local oil companies, which were American owned.
Right.
And Britain had something to do with this as well. I'm not.
Anglo-American oil.
Yeah.
Well, very interesting. So what do you think when you get back to your view of the progressive nature of globalization, going back to that blink of an eye to our cousins or descendants or ancestors, I should say, coming out of the trees into the plains? Where are we going here?
Well, I think that I mean what that explains is why coming together has been a more important part of the historical process than conflict. And now there's probably more conflict now than there has been, or more serious conflict now than there has been in the past, because of these problems of organization. But I think it's going to change again as the differences in economic and political power between America, the European Union, and the other large political units, especially China and India, they become more closely related to each other and have to reach some sort of agreement, because at the moment there's no effort at all to reach agreement on a global level. The United Nations was, in a way, developed with that purpose, but has been not been successful.
Well, I think we should probably leave it at there, Professor Spooner. Very interesting. I'm going to keep that in mind as I try to interpret the events of this week and the week coming up. So,
We'll watch what happens.
Yes. All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.